gentlemen, welcome, good morning. We are going to start our second plenary. My name is Marieke Kluin and I'm assistant professor from Leiden University, and I welcome you to our plenary on security, terrorism and borders. It is my distinct honor to introduce our first keynote speaker, Professor Lucia Zedner, a formidable scholar whose work continues to shape the frontiers of criminal justice, security and state authority. Professor Zedner is a professor of criminal justice at the University of Oxford Faculty of Law and a senior research fellow in law at All Souls College. Her academic journey began with a BA at the University of York and a DPhil at Nuffield College, Oxford, followed by a fellowship and sterling contributions to criminological scholarship. In her illustrious career, she has held positions at the London School of Economics, returned to Oxford as a professor, and was elected a Fellow of the British Academy, a testament to her outstanding contributions to the humanities and social sciences. Her research pursuits are razor-focused on criminal law, criminal justice, security, immigration control, citizenship, and counter-terrorism. Recent landmark works include security, preventive justice, changing contours of criminal justice, and privatizing border control. Professor Zedner is just not a prolific author, she is a critical thinker delivering bold insight. Her scholarship interrogates the tension between collective security and individual liberties, examining how preventive and securitized shifts in criminal justice often encourage on due process and transparency. Whether challenging the growing trend toward closed-door justice, problematizing the preventive state, or questioning the expansion of security powers post-9/11, her work cuts to the heart of whether criminal justice is still serving justice or merely serving security. In short, Professor Zedner combines academic rigor and fearless scrutiny. She demands we ask tough questions about the architecture of criminal justice and state power, and demands we look for answers that preserve both security and justice. Please join me in warmly welcoming Professor Lucia Zedner.
Good morning, and thank you so much for such a kind and generous welcome and introduction. I have my own thanks to the organising committee, to particularly, in fact, to Manos Billis, who is sitting in the front row and who invited me, or maybe coerced me into giving this lecture, and to all my colleagues, friends and associates over many, many, many years. I owe a lot to all of you, and look forward to hearing more from you later today. Good. So my topic this morning is entitled Border Force. Border Force, as it happens, is the name of the UK Immigration Control Authority, and I'll have more to say about that. Looking at migration policing as a form of counter-terrorism, or perhaps the reverse. We'll see. So briefly, an introduction to the questions and the issues that I want to address in the next 25-30 minutes. What we're seeing is in present-day developments is a very marked shift from the post-war consensus on what asylum seekers and refugees deserve in terms of rights to human dignity and freedom. Instead, we're seeing increasing recourse, and I will trace that history briefly in my lecture, recourse to border policing as a form of counter-terrorism to stop people who would commit terrorist acts from crossing national borders. And that in itself is problematic. But actually what I want to focus on in my lecture this morning is something much more problematic and which worries me very deeply, which is the decision by the UK government, and it's not alone, to treat migrants as if they were terrorists and to adopt terrorist-style powers in the handling and policing and prosecution of those who are seeking to enter our respective nations, and particularly those who are crossing the English Channel in small boats. Having said something about how that change, how that shift has occurred historically and is changing even today, I want to briefly consider some of the paradoxes and the harms of using terror tactics as a form of border control and as a matter of border policing. And end by reflecting even more briefly on what the implications of everything that I will say in the next 25 minutes are for border criminology, and for criminology indeed more generally. So you might ask, why should you, coming from countries all over Europe, be the least bit interested in a small, wet island that had the very bad taste to exit the EU in 2016, which, if you like, is remote from many of the concerns which are addressed much more directly on a daily basis here in Greece. If one looks at this map, you can see that actually the whole story of migration is one of a trajectory from the global south to the global north. And for many migrants, not all, because many of them don't make it, their ultimate destination is to the wealthiest countries of the global north, including the UK. So this is a story that affects everyone, and those routes run through many countries across Europe. So to return to my lecture proper, if we go back to the post-war period, there was a kind of post-war consensus about the rights of refugees, the rights to protection, the right to seek asylum, and seek asylum particularly from persecution. And that was instantiated in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and again in the UN Refugee Convention in 1951. Fast forward very rapidly, this is very bad history, to 2001, post 9/11, the UN Security Council passed one of very many resolutions following 9/11, in which it said that it was the duty incumbent upon all signatory states to prevent the movement of terrorists by effective border controls and to ensure that migrants themselves were not implicated in the planning or facilitation or participation in terrorist acts. That security resolution is not self-evident or palpably justified by the attacks and the atrocities of 9/11 itself. All of those who were engaged in those atrocities had entered the United States legally. So why the UN then thought it necessary to target migrants and remains an open question. Fast forward yet again, more bad history, 2014, the rise of the so-called Islamic State, the establishment of the caliphate in Syria and Iraq. A further UN Security Council resolution again requires that all states should prevent the movement of terrorists by effective border control. So we have a history at the international level and in international law of resort to border policing as a means by which to counter terrorism and try to prevent terrorists crossing borders in order to avert potentially catastrophic atrocities. Much to be said about that. I've said lots about it. Lots of other people have said a lot about that. But I want to focus in on this idea of border policing as counter-terrorism, and particularly in the UK case. What I'm about to talk about is not unique to the UK, but the UK has an unfortunate record of being a forerunner in many of these developments, not least because since 9/11, it's engaged in 25 years of hyper-legislation against terrorism. And many other countries have followed suit. It's not a good record to hold. So just to highlight some of those powers and to think about some of the issues that arise within them, Schedule 7 of the Terrorism Act 2000, passed even before 9/11, allowed the suspension of any requirement of suspicion by the police authorities and immigration control at the border. They were allowed to stop, search, detain, and interrogate without any grounds for suspicion, and that's true even to this day. Following the rise of ISIS under immigration law, it was made, the provisions for citizen deprivation were further extended to enable citizenship deprivation in the UK case, even where that was liable to result in statelessness. And I won't go into the detail there, we could talk about it later. Needless to say, it's in absolute contravention of the UN Convention on Statelessness, to which the UK had already entered a reservation. And then we see further provisions relating to passport seizure, temporary exclusion of those, and this is particularly targeted at so-called foreign terrorist fighters. You'll remember that when ISIS came to international prominence, thousands, tens of thousands of European citizens went to join the caliphate in Syria and Iraq. So passport seizure to prevent travel, temporary exclusion orders to prevent return, and then a provision for so-called managed return under very heavy surveillance by the security services. But we should also bear in mind that all of these powers were targeted at and justified by the need to try to prevent terrorist suspects from traveling across borders to commit terrible crimes. They were not targeted at migrants. What I'm about to describe is a very different picture. But just before I do, to remind those of you who were not aware of this at the time or since, Brexit was not only a supremely bad idea from which the United Kingdom has suffered terribly since, but was also a security disaster. I was involved in fairly high-level meetings with officials from the UK government, particularly the Foreign Office, and officials who came over from Brussels to discuss what would happen to each of the European-wide systems, and in fact many more, to which the UK would cease to be a member after Brexit. At those meetings, rather extraordinarily, the UK officials insisted that the biggest losses would be for our European partners. That was never true, and it was in reality proved to be far from true. The security losses for the UK were really, really damaging and very poorly offset by subsequent new working arrangements, bilateral agreements, and renewed cooperation with Frontex. It's done something to restore those relations, but actually we in the UK are in a very vulnerable position as a consequence of Brexit on security issues. So what does our current UK government do? They declare an intention to, and this is our Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, declares an intention to reset relations with Europe. Why Europe should want to reset relations with us is another question, but anyway, what does he choose as the basis for resetting those relations? Not the economy, not freedom of movement, not free movement of labour, but people crossing borders. And that's just ceased to work, so I will use. Okay, so we have a technical problem, which is nothing is working. 1 second. No. Yep, we need help. Nothing's moving, thank you. Oh, it's stuck. Well, I'll carry on talking, and hopefully the slides will catch up with us. So the substance, you'll just have to ignore what's on the screen, and I'll hope to be able to show it to you shortly. The substance of what the Prime Minister proposes is, and is currently in legislation before the House, is in effect an even greater militarisation of the UK border. We've seen the deployment of military quality drones, of coastal patrols, even of warships, and we've now got a massive increase of funding, a doubling of funding, more than doubling actually, of our so-called Border Security Command, which now has effective military status in the sense of that it has equal relations and communications with the other arms of our military and security services. And that militarization, I think, stands in some context, contrast and I will... Working?
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Okay. Some contrast to Frontex, and I will leave the others to comment on that, but I think the Frontex has a... so now it's restarted the timer. Great, thank you. Frontex has a more complex, I think, more complex relationship. No, nothing is... has a more complex relationship with its task, which of course is also militaristic, but combines humanitarian and human rights concerns in a much more, I think, thoughtful way. All right, I will carry on. We need to go back. Yeah, that's good. Next one. Can you just let's see that it works? All right, let's cross our fingers. Okay. So what we have in the UK is a very curious new set of policies. Curious is actually too generous a word. That is that the British government inspired, apparently, how one's inspired by counterterrorism, I'm not sure, plans to smash the smuggling gangs. It's a very belligerent, antagonistic language, by adopting counterterrorism style powers. I'm far from sure what counterterrorism style even means. It's kind of a bit like gangman style or something. But anyway, to pursue those who are engaged in people smuggling. There's no justification being offered for applying counterterrorism powers to small boat crossings across the English Channel. And there's a really big question about who in practice will be targeted. So I want to just give you a couple of examples from legislation which is before the UK government at the moment and which is very likely to pass in the coming weeks or months at most. It's a vast body of legislation. I'm just going to give you two examples for the sake of time, of two crimes, two new criminal offences which have been directly copied. I mean, even using the copy-paste button in Word from the existing counter-terrorism legislation. And what the terrorism legislation does is create a whole array, really dozens of so-called precursor or preventive crimes, which is justified insofar as those offences are justified at all by the potential catastrophic harms to life, to property, and so on, that are posed by terrorism. So we have these very early stage offences, which actually don't really look like crimes at all. Here are two of them. The first is the crime of supplying and handling articles for use in immigration crime. And this is an exact copy of an existing terrorism provision. And it carries over also not just the definition of the offence, but a maximum sentence of 14 years. The terrorism offence is 15 years maximum sentence in prison. So they took off 1 year in some kind of very inadequate recognition that immigration crime bears no relationship to the scale and the damage and the devastation that is potentially caused by terrorism. The offence has so-called extraterritorial jurisdiction, so it applies outside the UK as well, and that satisfies the ostensible reason that it's there to smash the gangs. The gangs, for the most part, are remaining safely off UK soil. UK, post-Brexit, has very limited ability to pursue those gangs. They rely upon bilateral cooperation with third-party countries. So I give you no prizes for guessing who in practice will be the main targets. And look at the picture. The second offence I just want to talk about, which I think is even more problematic, which is again a criminal offence from the terrorism sphere, which is the collection or recording of information reasonably suspected to be used in preparing a channel crossing. And that offence is very, very broad. You don't even need to take a piece of information into your own property. It's sufficient simply to view it on a single occasion online. The effect would be that a migrant who looks at their, or would-be migrant, who looks at their phone to check the weather report before they set out on very, very dangerous waters, and I can't emphasize how dangerous and how busy the English Channel is, full of tankers and huge ships. Looking at the weather report carries a maximum sentence of 5 years. Again, totally disproportionate to the offence. And of course, liable to lead to people to avoid detection, presuming they know about these offences at all, of crossing in dangerous weathers with obvious consequences. Okay. So I want to just think a little bit about how we should think about all of this. And I could talk a lot more about the provisions of the bill. It's very, very extensive, and it goes to things like surveillance, security, endangerment, all sorts of offences and other security provisions, which in my book have a very limited justification in the sphere of migration control and are problematic even when being used in the sphere of counterterrorism. So let's think first a little bit about some of the paradoxes of using terrorism tactics at the border. As I've said, in all likelihood, and even in the official documentation, it's recognized that in all likelihood, very few gang members will actually be successfully pursued using these offences and other powers. It's the migrants themselves who will face arrest. Part of that is justified on the basis that if you have really expansive crimes and really heavy sentences, that this will act as a deterrent. But there's an really obvious assumption there, which is that those who have travelled all the way across Europe from North Africa and so on will even know that these offences exist and care about them in the face of that from which they're fleeing in their determination to get to the UK. The offences also just disregard the existing risks to migrant in very unseaworthy boats and the dangers that the risk of arrest and potential prosecution will force migrants to take even greater risks to avoid interception. Even the official estimates reckon that only another 100 people a year, on top of current figures, will end up in prison as a result of these crimes. So the deterrent impact, given that we know that most offenders across criminality are more concerned about risk of arrest than they are about the substance of the offence, the idea that this will have any palpable effect or act as a deterrent seems to me questionable. There's also, I think, an important question to be asked about the harms imposed by crimmigration and by the terrorisation, if you like, of border policing. Part of the issue is that the politicians see themselves as talking in these tough terms and employing terrorist-style tactics. But they're not terrorist-style, they're just counter-terrorism laws, in all truth, to appease the far right, to appease populists, to appease anti-migrant sentiment. But actually, they're kind of buying into it, and they're compounding that vision of the migrant as a threat, as somehow akin to terrorists, and threatening the nation and the public. It drives up concerns of the threats of migration rather than assuaging them. And I say what I'm about to say now and on the next slide a little bit hesitantly because you may push back, to use a term. I wonder and I worry about whether we as criminologists are in some way complicit by adopting the language of crimmigration. It's a very descriptive and very important and powerful term. And by bringing border control into criminology, do we risk cementing the links between migration and crime, which are already profuse and prolific and widespread in public discourse? And there are plenty of examples historically. I was thinking about it my way in this morning, of terms like moral panic, folk devil, net widening, and so on, which began as criminological terms are now widely used in social media without any idea of where they came from. And very often, as in the case of enemy criminal law or the enemy other, become used not only by people who would criticize these powers, but actually in the case of Germany have been adopted. The idea of Feindstrafrecht has been adopted by the AfD in Germany and used on their placards. Do we risk, in a way, being complicit? So I want to suggest, and here again I'm hesitant and would like your criticisms, can we suggest an abolitionist perspective, or at least a partial abolitionist perspective? We know that 94% of all those who cross the Channel in small boats, the English Channel in small boats, make claims for asylum. Of those, the official figures tell us that in the last 7 years, fully 71% of those who have made claims have had their asylum claims granted. So there's an obvious and deeply problematic disjuncture between the characterization of migrants as somehow associated with terrorism and these figures, that these are actually bona fide asylum seekers. There's another rather obvious, and many of you have already written about it, solution, which is if we could create safer routes, if we could create more legal routes to enable people to arrive safely in their points in the countries at which they want to make these claims, then migrants could travel safely, the clientele of the gangs would diminish, and the need to smash the gangs with it. Border criminology is a vibrant and exciting and important field and has become hugely important within criminology itself, and I hope I see my own work as part of that and as contributing to that work in understanding border policing, the mechanisms of crimmigration, of detention, deportation, and so on. But I sometimes wonder, often very much in the small hours of the night, whether we shouldn't hope for the abolition or the decline of the need for us even to have a subdiscipline of border criminology. Could we possibly, and maybe this is naive and unduly optimistic, could we possibly hope for a day when border criminology could cease to exist, that we could return migrants and asylum seekers and refugees to where they belong properly, and did belong 25 years ago or so, in immigration law, in human rights law, in migration and refugee studies? So finally, and I feel uncomfortable actually, sorry about saying that, because I really value and applaud the work of border criminologists everywhere. I remain uncomfortable about even acknowledging the claim that migrants are criminals. So in conclusion, what I've tried to show is the ways in which one very wealthy country in the global north is raising up barriers and raising up legal walls by arming the border with counterterrorism style powers and laws. There's nothing style about them at all. Substantively, they are direct copies of existing counterterrorism legislation. In so doing, and I'll speak now only for the UK, my own country has abdicated responsibility for the hardships of those in the global south, which are driving the refugee crisis. What we're doing instead is seeking to contravene the very international laws and declarations and treaties to which we have signed, ignoring the norms and the values that underpin those treaties. And what's needed, not an abnegation or abrogation of responsibility, but actually an assumption of responsibility for tackling the global causes of the migrant crisis. And that's a responsibility that must and should fall on those countries with the highest GDP, mainly situated in the north of Europe. We need to face up to the legacy of post-colonialism. We need to really put our backs behind and our money behind funding, aid, economic development, and all the things that might help to address the drivers of the migration crisis. And the UK itself really must try to reset relations with Europe, which is desperately needed on many fronts, not through advocating counter-terrorism border powers, but by fair, humane and effective systems to enable legal migration, safe routes, legal arrival to make asylum claims, which are in the vast majority granted, such that we could reframe the narrative on asylum and immigration. What I'd finish by saying, and it's a genuine plea, is what can we as criminologists, and particularly as border criminologists, do to support this task? Thank you.
Thank you. We will take questions and answers after our second keynote speaker. It is my great pleasure to introduce to you Professor Maartje van der Woude, Professor of Law and Society at Leiden University van Vollenhoven Institute for Law, Governance and Society. Her research rigorously tackles the merging of crime control, counterterrorism and immigration control, a phenomenon she powerfully termed as crimigration, investigating how security, borders and belonging intertwine, often in ways that challenge our values. A standout component of her work is the VD project Getting to the Core of Crimigration, which uses multi-level empirical research to unearth how local and supranational actors shape borderland governance, addressing issues as sovereignty, race, and legal discretion along the way. But her influence doesn't stop at research. In May 2025, she was appointed as one of the 3 series editors for the Routledge Studies in Criminal Justice and Borders and Citizenship. And earlier this year, in January 2025, she received the Theoretical Criminology Best Article Prize for perceptive work with Dr. Irene Vega on the paradox of color blindness in border enforcement, highlighting how structural inequalities are often hidden in plain sight. And beyond academia, she brings added depth to her perspective, serving as an honorary judge in the District Criminal Court of Southern Holland, advising migration policy through the Dutch Advisory Committee on Migration Affairs, and guiding interdisciplinary scholarship via her roles in different networks. In short, Professor van der Woude is not here to sugarcoat or play it safe. She dares to ask difficult questions, to expose the tension between security and freedom, and to do so with both empirical seriousness and legal nuance. Her work reminds us that how we control migration is not just about policy, it's about the kind of society we want to be. Please join me in welcoming Maartje van der Woude.
Thank you, Marieke, for a wonderful introduction. Now I'm even more nervous than I already was, because I'm supposedly not playing it safe. So let's see what I do today. Thank you to the organizing committee for this conference. It's an honor to be here. And it's very exciting to share some work in progress, which builds upon my previous work that I've done so far with you today. With an eye on the time, I did write it out, so you'll see me move back and forth between my tablet and you to make sure that I don't go over time. But I have a few slides with mostly quotes from my field work that I want to share with you. I don't think it's moving. It's this one. I'll just start. It was a young man, the officer told me, slouched in his seat, no luggage, avoided eye contact. Maybe he was scared. Maybe nothing was wrong. But still, you must act. You make decisions based on feeling, and you must learn to trust the feeling. End of quote. It wasn't spectacular. No violence, no arrest, just a quiet train car near the German border. And yet, this moment captures what I want to talk about today. Because here, we are not watching a border being simply enforced, we are watching the emotional choreography of state power. In border work, emotions and affect are inseparable. Officers engage in emotional labor, regulating their own feelings to foster compliance or calm, while at the same time performing affective labor, generating and sustaining atmospheres of suspicion, urgency, and threat. My long-term ethnography with the Dutch Military and Border Police, which I will shorten as MBP from now on, because that will save me 5 minutes, shows that Europe's borders are governed not just through law or policy, but through anticipation, affect, and preemptive emotion work. The conference theme also invites us to consider the reasoning behind state responses to harm. My argument is that the logos of border control today is not only rational, but it is visceral. And if governance is increasingly visceral, what does that mean for criminology? This is not just an analytical question, but it's an ethical one. And I invite you to keep it in mind as we move through the stories and the arguments ahead. My claim is that borders now function as emotional and affective infrastructures, spaces where named emotions, suspicion, compassion, pride, and diffuse atmospheres, urgency, tension, indifference, work together to consolidate power. These emotions do not just stick to certain travelers, they also adhere to those who guard the border, shaping their sense of duty, loyalty, and moral fatigue. This resonates with what Savio, Wammen, and Kohl call affective border work, showing how European migration governance mobilizes emotions like fear, despair, and even hope to deter and control mobility. Where their focus is on return policies and campaigns abroad, my work traces how these effective dynamics take shape in the everyday routines of Dutch border policing. And at the heart of this effective choreography lies a mantra I heard repeatedly in the field. We are here to protect the security of the state. If you ask a Dutch border control officer what their core task is, most won't say checking passports or preventing irregular migration. They will proudly recite this mantra without hesitation. This answer is quite striking from a legal point of view. The Dutch Military and Border Police, DMP, operates under migration law, not criminal law. Their work concerns irregular migration, a civil matter, yet they see themselves as frontline defenders in a broader security theater. And this is not just a localized quirk of language unique to the Netherlands. Across Europe, we also just heard Lucy as example from the UK, migration control has been narratively braided with terrorism, organized crime, and societal destabilization. In EU communications and ministerial speeches, irregular migration is rarely an administrative issue. It is cast as an existential challenge. So the mantra condenses this perfectly. It ties the mundane, train checks, roadside patrols, to a grand project of state protection. And it blurs the line between migration and criminal law, between administrative enforcement and national security. As I argue in my recently published book, The Mobility Control Apparatus, state security serves as a double function, elevating migration's control moral authority and expanding its mandate, normalizing measures meant for exceptional threats, from the so-called migration crisis of 2015 to post-Brussels counterterrorism to today's talk of so-called hybrid threats. The figure of the foreigner and the figure of the threat are continually redrawn. Crucially, state security is a floating signifier, to borrow Laclau's term, absorbing shifting anxieties and legitimizing new interventions. In the Dutch case, this produces a paradox. Border policing framed as urgent security work, yet anchored in a legal framework not about crime at all. Still, in officers' minds and bodies, the work feels morally protective. What happens when the language of protecting the state is translated into the day-to-day pragmatics of border work? To show you what this looks like up close, I will share 4 short vignettes with you from my research. Each is drawn from a different moment in the life of the border. A cultivated hunch on a train platform, the pressure to produce results on a slow day, an act of bureaucratic compassion, and a crisis of conscience over racial profiling. I present these vignettes not as isolated anecdotes. They move in silence, a practiced rhythm. One officer, not in isolated anecdotes, but as windows into the emotional infrastructures of border work. Each one reveals how feelings are not incidental byproducts of the job, but core tools of governance. So we turn to the first vignette. A small team boards a train from Belgium. The officers move in silence, a practiced rhythm. One officer by the door, two walking the aisle, scanning faces. An officer notices a man slouched in his seat. No luggage, avoiding eye contact. Later, over coffee, the officer tells me, "I immediately felt it. Something's not right here, but you never know for sure. You make decisions based on feelings, and you must learn to trust that feeling." It is tempting to call this intuition, but in the MBP it is more structured, suspicion that has been taught, refined, and legitimized. Officers talk about stacking pluses, small signs that mean little alone, but together justify a stop, a non-Western appearance, clothes unsuited to the season, a certain type of bag, sitting too still or moving too much, avoiding eye contact or making eye contact, speaking a foreign language or Dutch with the wrong accent. Even a book can count. This is not random noticing. It is a professionalized, suspicious gaze. Officers describe learning to read the platform like a code. They tell me tracksuit and cheap sneakers, that's a plus. No luggage on a long-distance train, definitely a plus. Each plus tips the scale toward a stop. The man on the train had several: no luggage, withdrawn posture, and in the officer's eye, a look that didn't match the other passengers. These cues aligned with the MBP's task, to detect people who might lack valid documents or a visa. From the perspective of the state, the stop was justified. But whether the stop was right is almost beside the point. He did find the man's Schengen visa had expired, but the process, the scanning, the mental tally of pluses, the reliance on racialized and class-coded markers is the system itself. It trains officers to convert embodied impressions into state action. For the man, the outcome was detention and removal. For the officer, it was another tick in the day's tally, another reinforcement that the feeling could be trusted, should be trusted. Each success, however small, confirmed the skill of preemption. And border work is not just about recognizing a moment of suspicion when it arises. It is about sustaining that vigilance across hours, shifts, and long stretches when nothing happens, which brings me to the second vignette. It is just after lunch on a gray Tuesday. A roadside patrol car idles near the border. For an hour, nothing really stands out. Family sedans, delivery vans, commuters in hatchbacks. One officer shrugs, "If we don't find anything, people think we're wasting time, so that's when you notice you start to look harder." This is the effective economy of border policing, the quiet pressure to turn vigilance into results. Suspicion is not only a reaction to what's in front of you, it must be kept alive, even when nothing obvious presents itself. In the patrols I observed, the pressure was really measurable. Statistics on stops were discussed in morning briefings. Teamed compared informally scores at the end of the shift. A day of no detections was felt as being unproductive, even if technically it might meant that the border had not been crossed irregularly. To meet that demand, the gaze sharpens. Officers start looking for smaller cues. A scuffed suitcase, a driver gripping the wheel too tightly, condensation on the window suggesting hidden passengers. Vehicles are being read like bodies. Old Peugeot from Brussels, plus a curtain in the back window, plus Dutch plates but foreign-looking driver could be a plus. Each small sign adds weight, even if the underlying suspicion is thin. The effect is cumulative. The border becomes not just a place to detect irregularity, but a place where irregularity must be found. Vigilance becomes self-sustaining. The more you look, the more you notice, the more you notice, the more you must act. Sometimes what lingers is not suspicion, but discomfort. A flicker of empathy surfaces, even if it cannot change the outcome. These moments reveal another layer of the border's emotional infrastructure. The space where rules meet human contact and where compassion, if it appears at all, is carefully rationed. Which brings me to the third vignette. One officer, I will call him Willem, tells me about one case that stayed with him, a routine Flixbus check, international bus. Passengers waiting in the bus for the check to be over, documents in hand. He tells me how among them he found a Moroccan woman in her 50s, her Dutch flawless. She had lived in the Netherlands for 30 years, but without papers. She was brought over as a child by an uncle, kept out of school, made to work in the home as what Willem called a domestic slave. Eventually, she broke with the family and built an independent life for her own. But now she was ill with cancer. If sent back to Morocco, she explained to him, there would be no medical care for her, and it would be a death sentence, really. Willem told me that he could have processed her like any other irregular migrant, formal identification, detention, a file in the system. Instead, he went to his supervisor and they found a stopgap, a bi-weekly reporting requirement to the Dutch immigration authorities that would allow her to stay in treatment in the Netherlands despite her irregular status. He tells me, I could not take that away from her, the possibility to heal. 8 years later, Willem found out that the woman was deported after another control elsewhere along the Dutch border. Before she left, she sent a message through colleagues to thank Willem. He said, these are the stories that stick with you. It's easy to read this little scene as an act of kindness, and in one sense it obviously was. But we have to look at the power imbalance between the two actors. Willem's compassion could soften her immediate fate, but not alter her long-term vulnerability. The same machinery that allowed him to make an exception also ensured she would eventually be removed. For him, the residue of the interaction was a human connection, a sense of having done right in a difficult case. For her, it was also years lived in the shadow of expulsion. This is what bureaucratic compassion looks like at the border. Empathy channeled through procedural constraints, human concern that operates within and ultimately upholds the enforcement apparatus. My last vignette. Another officer told me about a tension that shook his sense of professional integrity. It came after a recent landmark ruling by the Hague Court of Appeals. The court prohibited any use of ethnicity in border checks. Civil society groups had accused the MBP of racial profiling, and the judges agreed, calling it discrimination in any form. For the officer, the hardest part was what the ruling implied. He tells me, I've had such a hard time with it, because it basically means that all the time I've worked on the operational level, well, I discriminated, and that makes me feel worthless. Because if there's one thing I can't stand, it's discrimination. Colleagues, especially long-serving ones, he tells me, began asking themselves the same thing. So have we been racist and discriminatory all these years? Most insist that they had never acted without prejudice. Yet many admitted they knew colleagues who had, and who still would. In some brigades, checks were halted for weeks with the organization recalibrating itself. New guidelines followed, tools for reflexivity, reminders to resist the old racialized hunch. On paper, it seems like progress, but in practice, nobody really knows if anything really changed. Officers themselves doubt it. The routines, the atmospheres, the suspicious gaze all seemed to persist, only now framed in the language of compliance. This is organizational dissonance at its sharpest. When an officer's self-image as fair and principled collides with the fact that the very structure of the work has relied on practices they reject. These emotional contradictions don't break the system, they sustain it. Doubts can be voiced, even widely shared, but it's folded back into operational life. The apparatus adapts, the checks continue, and the contradiction remains unsolved. Borders today are mobile, dispersed and sometimes invisible. In train patrols far from the frontier, in airport data terminals, in the rituals of airline check-in. If they have lost solidity, they have gained mood. A passport check is not just the moment of enforcement. It is the endpoint of an emotional field that precedes it. Political speeches about crisis, operational briefings invoking terrorism, and media headlines about flows all thicken the air in which an officer decides whether a slouched posture is mere fatigue or a sign of risk. Ben Anderson called this the management of mood, the crafting of an ambient sense of necessity. His point is that security today governs less by hard rules than by atmosphere, by managing the very mood in which decisions are made, so that suspicion already feels necessary before a word is spoken. You can feel it in the smallest gestures, the clipped passport please, the silence of a patrol moving through a train, and the sideways glance that suddenly acquires weight. Once you see borders as atmospheres, you notice the machinery that sustains them. The EU doesn't only coordinate laws, it produces borders as an ongoing process. Frontex joint operations, shared trainings, interagency intelligence. These are not just technical exchanges, but circulations of perception. Scripts for what counts as suspicious and who fits the profile of risk. At the border, emotions do not just accompany governance, they are its method. Officers do not only check passports, they sort feelings. Sarah Ahmed reminds us that emotions stick to certain bodies before they even appear. The veiled woman, the black man, the unaccompanied youth. These figures arrive already charged with affective value, primed to be read as risky or out of place. And this is part of what Borelli, Lindbergh, and Weiss call states of suspicion. Suspicion that is not incidental, but institutionalized, saturating law, bureaucracy, and technology, and producing hierarchies of risk and belonging. But how does suspicion move from atmosphere to action? Lindbergh and Borelli describe how fleeting impressions, a look, a posture, a document detail, are folded into so-called state-crafted dominant fictions. Momentary cues that, once circulated through bureaucratic routines, come to look like reliable knowledge. In the field, I saw this dynamic directly. Officers stacking pluses, right? Learning how to convert doubt into procedure and having each successful stop learning, confirm that their feeling could be trusted. Suspicion is not the only register of border effect. It's a strong one, but not the only one. Alongside it, I also found compassion rationed, pride performed, fatigue absorbed. These were not fleeting moods, but patterned oscillations officers learned as part of their professional repertoire. My material echoes what Aliverti colleagues show elsewhere, that legitimacy depends on navigating moral dilemmas. The pains of bureaucratic care, compromises of benevolent policing, the uneasy coexistence of compassion and control. In practice, officers toggled between those modes, softening a procedure one moment, sharpening suspicion the next, moving with the rhythm of the institution rather than against it. And there is another register still. As Irene Vega argues in her recent book, neutrality is not absence but effective labor. The shrug, these are just the rules, is not detachment. It is a performance of bureaucratic indifference that cloaks exclusion in calm routine, making it appear ordinary, even benevolent. In my Dutch fieldwork, this indifference was as important to the machinery as suspicion or compassion. Together they formed a choreography, an effective infrastructure that sustains European border governance. And here lies Europe's contradiction. On the one hand, it presents itself as a guardian of dignity and rights. On the other, it cultivates atmospheres that normalize suspicion, ration compassion, and blur the line between humanitarian care and security control. This contradiction is not hidden, it is lived. Officers speak sincerely about protecting dignity while recounting the satisfaction of a, quote, good catch. Policies affirm asylum rights while funding operations that treat mobility itself as a threat. And it's precisely the effective register, humanitarian and securitarian at once, that makes the contradiction so durable. It gives officers moral purpose while enacting exclusion. It gives the public a sense of safety while masking the costs of that safety. And it produces some of the tensions the vignettes show. Which raises the deeper question, which I won't answer in this talk, what can we expect from street-level agents when they are tasked with performing a contradiction that Europe itself has produced? I'm coming to a closing. because I'm going to ask the question, what does all this mean for criminology? Criminology has never been one thing. Along mainstream approaches that take the state as a more or less given, there has always been a critical tradition, one that has insisted on looking at the state itself as a problem, exposing how its practices of punishment and control produce harm as much as they prevent it. In the times we live in, that tradition is not just valuable, it is essential. With state violence visible at borders across the world, and when entire populations are subjected to exclusion, dispossession, and even annihilation, the task of critical criminology is paramount. It calls on us to interrogate the state not as a neutral backdrop, but as a set of practices, effects, and legitimizing narratives. The very emotional and effective infrastructures we've seen at work in border policing. For criminology, this opens a double task. First, to bring these infrastructures into view, to read emotions as signals of how governance works, and second, to confront the harms they produce. Deportation despite medical need, routinized racialized suspicion, the erosion of dignity through bureaucratic indifference. None of these appear in crime statistics, yet they are injuries generated and justified by the state. And this is where semiology is crucial. By insisting on looking beyond the confines of criminal law, it helps us recognize borders as engines of non-criminalized harms, chronic uncertainty, institutionalized humiliation, and psychic toll of permanent suspicion. But analysis alone is not enough. Criminology must also reckon with its own position. Borders are not just out there, they are in here, shaping our categories, our silences, and our complicities. If we cannot make the effective life of the border visible, we risk lending cover to the very moral economy that makes its violence appear necessary. And I want to end not only with a call to us as individual criminologists, but with a call to our professional societies, including the European Society for Criminology. As Claire Hamilton recently argued in the European Journal for Criminology, in her reflections on doing European criminology in a demagogic age, the discipline has too often retreated into narrow technocratic analysis, hesitant to name its own moral and political stakes. That search for neutrality may feel safe, but in times when exclusionary practices are expanding and when state security is invoked to normalize violence, such hesitation risks complicity. If borders are sustained not just by fences but by feelings, not just by policies but by moral economies, then our professional communities also have responsibilities. As members of these societies, we decide whether silence will prevail in the face of state violence or whether criminology will raise its voice to contest the categories, the exclusions, and the harms that are made to appear necessary. Because at the heart of all this lies a mantra I heard repeatedly in the field. We are here to protect the security of the state. That phrase does more than authorize control. It makes control feel righteous. It cloaks violence in moral necessity, and it turns suspicion, compassion, and indifference into forms of labor that stabilize legitimacy. And it shows us that state-making today is not only legal or territorial, it is effective, it's embodied, and lived. So the question I'll leave you with is this. If the border today is built as much out of feelings as it is out of walls and fences, then what and who will it take to dismantle it? And if dismantling means undoing the emotional infrastructures that sustain harm, then criminology itself must decide what side it is on. To take the state's categories at face value or to contest them, to remain silent or to refuse complicity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lucia and Maartje, for these wonderful and inspirational speeches. And now the floor is open for questions.
Hi. Hello, can you hear me? Okay. So thank you both for your very, very interesting and engaging presentations. I have a question for Professor Zedner. In your opinion, is the goal of the UK legislators to prosecute gang activity and they just haven't evaluated the efficacy of the measures, or are they really looking for a legal front to, in fact, prosecute migration?
Thank you. It's an excellent question, I think it can best be answered by looking at the history of UK legislative activity over the last several years. We already have provisions by the UK government to criminalise assistance at sea, even when not for gain. We have a provision to criminalise not merely entry into the UK, that is entry at the point of passport control, but merely arrival, by which placing your foot on the tarmac or the beach is sufficient to attract criminal sanction, and to make it in practice and in law impossible to claim asylum once on British soil. That's the de facto situation. So I think there's some lack of lack of honesty on the part of the British government when they say they're seeking to smash the gangs. There are many other provisions within the current legislation which I didn't talk about for lack of time. One of them is an endangerment offence, which applies only to those who are in the boats crossing the water, and has no applicability to gang members unless they happen also to be in the boats and seeking to arrive in the UK. So the rhetoric operates at one level, focusing on the gangs. The reality and the history tells, I think, another story. Thank you.
Hello, thank you very much for both presentations. It's really, really interesting. I have a question for both of you. It's an open one. At the state level, for you, which institution hold an epistemic position of power to define threat figures? Because if we want to challenge the narrative of the association with migration and risk, we have to know which institution hold the power to define threat figure, I think.
Thank you so much for that question. That's a question that has been milling through my head for many, many years. Like, who do we need to tackle in order to make a difference? I think it's a multi-layered answer, right? I think there's never, if you look at like street level agents who are the most visible enactors of state power, and you change their minds, things will be different. That's why I raised that question and then didn't answer it, because they operate obviously like in a larger realm of legislation being created, and in Europe that is national legislation, European legislation. So I think it's very complex, yet, and it might not have shown through the vignettes that I shared today. I do believe very much in sort of fostering change from within the enforcement institutions, and in a way that it'll be a long development, but trying to sort of get or challenge narratives that are very prominent and prevalent there, showing people with different pieces of information that they won't necessarily get through the institution. So for me, the answer would be looking at street level enforcement agencies and trying to foster change from within in these institutions. But it'll be difficult. We'll be here 10 years from now and still debating the same thing.
Just very briefly, I really admire the micro level and fascinating research that Martia is engaged in. I tend to operate, and I don't defend this as being better or anything, rather at the macro level. In the UK case, we have something called the National Security Risk Assessment, which operates not within policing, not within the Home Office, that's the Secretary of Interior, but rather within the Cabinet Office, that is the office of the Prime Minister. It tells you something about the degree to which security threats are identified and sought to be countered at a very high political level. But there are much more powerful, and I mentioned them in my lectures, international law levels, not least the power of the UN Security Council and their very frequent and increasingly frequent resolutions that in effect mandate compliance by member states on a huge array of security matters. And then, of course, there's the work of the security services, which is incredibly hard for us as criminologists really to see or to understand, but is doing, at least in the UK case, an enormous amount of work in defining threat and setting the political agenda. And then there's everything that Marta just said.
Thank you so much for really amazing presentations, really fascinating. And I was wondering, and it's a question to both of you, given the current climate, which actually at the continuum from humanitarianism towards securitization definitely is shifting towards securitization, when we see from both Dutch case and the UK, but many other countries, that actually criminalization is increasingly used at the expense of social justice, redistribution, etc., etc. So the values of dignity, the human rights that you've mentioned are not really having much prominence, it seems, right now. Actually, we witness suspensions of rights, like in some countries, asylum seekers cannot apply for asylum anymore, like Poland, for example. At the Polish-Belarusian border, we have a suspension of family reunification, etc., etc. So we see that we are not really having this contradiction anymore. It's becoming the more straightforward criminalization, securitization framing. So what to do with that? Like, where do we go from here as humans and as social scientists, criminologists?
You want us to solve that huge question?
Sorry. Yeah, I mean, it's a really, really important question, and it's happening at every level, and it's certainly happening at the national level. And there's a continuous push both from within government, particularly within the news media, and from some very powerful external groups, not least think tanks and policy institutes, pushing for, in the UK case, for withdrawal from the European Convention. And I would say that we will see movement on that in the next year. I hope it's more partial than I fear. But we already see the erosion of particular rights. I mean, there was an announcement just last week that the UK Labour government, which has, one might think, had a more liberal democratic outlook, has the intention to, I would say, I'll use the word undermine, but maybe that's too strong, Article 8 of the European Convention, rights to privacy and family life, by limiting the rights of family members to join those who are already in the UK. So that was very depressing, sorry.
No, and I think when you look at the development throughout Europe with different European countries temporarily, but then not so temporarily reinstating internal border control, it really, it mirrors what you're saying. And I think the question, like, where do we go from here, and what does it mean for us as a, as a discipline? I think it's a personal question. Like, it can mean different things for different people. For me, I can talk about what it means to me. For me, it only sort of further fuels the deeply sort of like felt need to continue doing my research within these institutions that are in a way like contributing to that securitization, because I want to understand as much as I can from that micro level, looking up like where do the tensions lie, and because where there is tension, there is also room for friction. And I haven't identified the tensions just yet, but seeing what is happening, I can do two things. I can be really depressed, like, and stay in my bed and not show up for any of my lectures at all, or I could just drag my ass to the field and try to figure out what's going on and how people are able to be okay with that, right? Like, how are people able to work within these institutions? So that's how I would react to your question. But I'm as concerned as you are.
We have room for one more question.
Thank you very much for both your very interesting presentations. I have a question for Ms. Sedner. You suggested that we should, or the EU might want to introduce safer routes for asylum seekers to prevent the thousands of people who drown each year. My question is the following. If you look at the election results in many European countries, it's not really far-fetched to say that large proportions in these countries of the population perceive problems with migration, of certain types of migrations or level of migration. If we should introduce these safer routes, do you think that will solve the problems or perceived problems of these people?
How long have we got? I mean, yeah, it's extraordinarily difficult, and one can see that politicians across European countries, and your example of the applications to reintroduce border controls by many European member states, as testimony to this, politicians see the populist demands for pushback against migration as being a threat to the status and standing and electability of parties which might not share those views. The difficulty I see, and I alluded to it in my lecture, is that the more one attempts to either outpace those populist demands and the demands of particularly of the extreme right, by occupying their territory, the more that one pushes the agenda further to the right. So I don't have an answer to your question or a solution to your question, but I'm pretty confident that actually adopting the populist objection to migration and forgetting everything that we signed up to in the post-war period is not the way to go, and will only lead to further populist xenophobia and anti-migrant sentiment.
Thank you very much. That concludes this session, and thank you so much for your inspiring speeches.